So let's talk about the regulatory environment. I know we're coming up on time for this podcast, but so what's happening? I understand there's a ton of stuff. I don't understand a ton of stuff. Let me backtrack. I have heard there is a ton of stuff happening in the EU. Could you just explain what's happening over there? How does it tie into this whole conversation?
Yeah, in late April, the European Commission came out with a proposal for something called the Artificial Intelligence Act. And what the Artificial Intelligence Act does is it requires companies that are using high-risk AI systems to essentially have something they call a quality management system that achieves regulations in a number of different areas. So the areas they kind of stipulate a set of regulations around high-quality data sets, record keeping, transparency, human oversight, and accuracy and robustness and security. So if you remember in the prior discussion we had about there's model quality, there's data quality, and then there's processes, this actually creates regulations for across all of those. And the companies in these high-risk sectors that they designate are going to have to adhere to these regulations and file what's called conformity reports. And that's something that they need to do whenever they put out a commercial AI system in some of these designated high-risk areas. So this is a proposal. It's going to go through a process of being approved, but typically the European Commission doesn't put these things out unless there's a pretty good high chance of them being approved. But we'll see. But in effect, this becomes like the GDPR of AI. And what happened with GDPR is that these regulations really kind of set the tone for the rest of the world. And what you see is a lot of other jurisdictions adopting elements of those. And some of that has already happened. So there have been a couple of privacy acts that have been passed. So most recently, there was a ballot measure in California called the California Privacy Rights Act. And in part of that, there are elements around automated decision making, where you will be required to explain automated decisions. So that will cover AI as well. And then in the U.S., most recently, the FTC made an announcement that they were going to pay more attention to this stuff as well. And I think the words they used was hold yourself accountable or be prepared for the FTC to hold you accountable. So the EC regulations are really kind of the headline of a whole set of regulatory developments that are really across the world. But the EC would be the most kind of direct AI focused legislation ever put in place.
And what's the, we've seen that pattern play out, as you mentioned, GDPR, right? That just rolled across everybody. It's almost like California setting a regulatory environment inside the US, where all the other states say, oh, well, we'll just follow that because that's we want to be in that market. Therefore, we might as well make one version of everything. And if we can get there, we can sell everywhere. So I can see the same thing where the EU kind of sets the bar, everybody else follows suit, and it kind of is the great leveling as because everybody wants to access all these different markets and play in all these different markets. So what's the sort of real world impact of that right now? How far out is this potential, impact from this regulation?
Yeah, it like GDPR, I think they're going to try to pass it sometime this year, maybe, but there'll be a time period before the regulations get put in place to give people time to adhere to those. Practically speaking, I think that's going to be a couple years out, but what you tended to see with GDPR was that, once it gets passed, everybody starts working on it essentially because they know this is coming. So I think once it gets passed, I think people will likely start working on it. And for these high risk, kind of systems, they're essentially going to need to put in these AI quality management systems. That's, it almost kind of requires that you either need to build or buy some software in order for you to conform to these regulations and put in place this quality management system that the EC mentions.
So is there a place that people can go right now? Is there an AI quality management, international standards body? Because I don't believe I've ever heard of one.
Yeah, no, there isn't. But there have been a lot of efforts, and oftentimes they're under the nomenclature of trustworthy AI.
Sure.
So there's been a bunch of guidelines around trustworthy AI. We're actually working in a consortium called the Veritas Consortium with the Monetary Authority of Singapore. They put out some principles called the FEAT principles, or fairness, equity, accountability, and transparency principles. And they did that. They were one of the first to do that. Hong Kong also did something very similar. And now there's a group of software vendors and financial services institutions that are working with the Monetary Authority of Singapore to put in place practical standards for people to adhere to these kinds of principles. So there's been a lot of work done in this area of trustworthy AI, and there's a lot of guidelines around trustworthy AI. I think that, and that's been more focused on particular segments. So financial services have long used models, and they've long had kind of guidelines around the use of those models. That's, as you pointed out, Troy, the model risk management principles that have long been in place. And so they've been kind of one of the first to build out, a set of guidelines around model risk management, and now those are being adapted, to machine learning. So you can look to a lot of those efforts. There's in the UK, there's something called the AI Public-Private Forum that's sponsored by the Bank of England and the FCA there. And then, I think that there are, the OECD actually has a tracker of all of these. There's tons of legislations and efforts and bodies like this around the world that are kind of looking at this problem, but there isn't really kind of one universally accepted set of standards. Something we're going to try to do at TruEra is provide like a research section of our website to try to give people a lot more of the practical ideas around explainability, trustworthy AI, responsible AI, and things like that. But I think it's an area that needs more kind of educational materials.